I have two questions. The first is about the speakers on today's panel and why no one from the elected Jewish Lithuanian community was invited to speak. And my second question is about the proposed civic convention center on the site of a Jewish cemetery and whether YIVO is going to speak out against it.
So, as for why no one from the Jewish community in Lithuania was invited to speak, simply we can't invite everyone. Let me put it that way. Second, it was by no means, I think the implication of your question is that they were being purposefully excluded, and they are not, from this conversation. But I think it would be a bit unwieldy to have more than 4 people on this stage. And as for YIVO's denouncing policies of the Lithuanian government, YIVO is not a political institution. We do not advocate against particular policies. I have had discussions with members of the Jewish community in Lithuania about this issue, and I understand it's an extremely complicated one.
Can I say something
Yes.
to this issue? We're talking about the Šnipiškės Cemetery. I frankly, here I think the Lithuanian government actually deserves credit. And I think there's a distorted picture that's out there. And frankly, it's passed itself around repeatedly on the internet and different Jewish sites and so on. There is a Soviet-era sports center that was built right on the cemetery. Obviously, it was done when there was no control, no concern on the part of a Soviet government. Surely many graves were disturbed when that happened. And that's a legacy that the current government has. There were, the property itself at one point, going back now some decades, was sold. There was a private developer who had all sorts of plans, and there was a legitimate outcry. At that point, the government ultimately stepped in and effectively bought back the property. There was some construction that took place, new apartments on the border of the cemetery. Some controversy or debate, was this actually over graves or only adjacent to the cemetery? There were different borders. After that, with outside encouragement, I want to say by American Jewish Committee and other groups as well, the Lithuanian government consulted and entered into really a formal agreement with someone who's perhaps the most authoritative rabbinic voice when it comes to the preservation of cemeteries, an ultra-Orthodox rabbi in London, Eliakim Schlesinger, who chairs the Committee for the Preservation of Jewish Cemeteries in Europe. And they've been a partner to the government in the discussion of what to do and how to deal with this tragic situation. You have a building that's abandoned. You have a cemetery around it. There are plans to renovate it. The choices are few. And I think the rabbis themselves believed that to actually remove the building may disturb more graves, more bodies than leaving it alone. So the idea of removing it or keeping it is not a clear-cut picture. There's no real good solution. There was an agreement that the building would be renovated, that would be overseen in the whole construction process by these rabbinic authorities, that there would be no new work done on the site, that the remainder would be clearly identified as the cemetery it has been, as a kind of a garden with memorial inscriptions and other things. It seems to me in an awful situation, and this is far from unique in this part of the world. Many former Jewish cemeteries or Jewish cemeteries no longer used that have become sites for building and other things. So in this case, the Lithuanian government, and this goes back now a decade, recognized that it would only address this issue with the full involvement of halakhic authorities. So I think people need to understand that. You may disagree on what they suggest as the solution, but it's certainly not ignoring the very real concerns that Jews may have.
Correct some issues, but I did want to say that the efforts of the Lithuanian government to establish a bridge to the Jewish community is very much appreciated. I've spoken to a number of people. The mayor of Lithuania was here. We had some good conversations. But there are elements which are very, very distressing. There were 2 apartment complexes built in the cemetery. One of them was built in 2005 and one in 2007, 2008. We have yet to be told where the tons of human remains and skeletons were dumped. We want to rebury them. And the Lithuanian government is simply not interested. We've had promises, we've had reassurances. It's never happened. So that's an element of bad faith which we feel is not consistent with all of the conversations we've heard tonight. The other point I wanted to make is that, with all due respect for Rabbi Schlesinger, who is a very, very respected rabbi, he's practically alone in the world. Virtually every other Orthodox Jewish rabbi, every leader, the chief rabbis of Israel, everyone's opposed to the desecration, the further desecration and defilement which will recur, making the sports palace, the Soviet sports palace, into a concert and convention center. That's not appropriate for a cemetery. Even if there were not going to be further incursions in the cemetery itself. So I don't know whether you can be a messenger, Mr. Minister, but there is distress all across the world over this impending project, and we hope it'll be stopped.